A concrete flying saucer sits on a fogged mountain summit in Bulgaria, its red star still visible through the mist. Inside, the dome is gutted, mosaics stripped and sold, graffiti covering art once among the most ambitious in Eastern Europe. This was supposed to last forever, an eternal shrine to an ideology that believed it had already won. Soviet artists spent years finishing it. Then the system it celebrated collapsed almost overnight, and the building was still warm when everyone walked out. This is one of several Soviet monuments built as permanent. Some of them didn't even get 8 years. That mountaintop dome is Buzludzha, finished in 1981 by the Bulgarian Communist Party. It wasn't built by Moscow directly, but Bulgaria sat firmly inside the Soviet orbit, and the monument was built in that same spirit of permanence, at that same architectural scale. The site itself mattered before a single stone was laid. It marked the ridge where Bulgarian socialists had gathered generations earlier, and the party wanted that history frozen in concrete forever, visible from valleys on both sides of the mountain. Soviet-trained artists covered the interior in enormous mosaics, well over 500 square meters of them, showing Marx, Engels, Lenin, and long columns of workers marching toward a future the party considered inevitable. The structure took years of specialized labor, imported materials, and a level of state funding most small countries would never justify spending on a single building, let alone one sitting alone on an empty mountaintop. Then, quite suddenly, came 1989. Communist governments across Eastern Europe fell in the span of months, one after another, dominoes going down almost on schedule, and Bulgaria's government went with them. Buzludzha had opened in 1981. By 1989, the ideology it was built to celebrate no longer existed anywhere with real power behind it. That's roughly 8 years between the ribbon-cutting ceremony and total abandonment. Nobody ever secured the doors properly afterward. Looters stripped the copper roofing first, sheet by sheet. Then they went after the mosaic tiles, prying them off the walls piece by piece and selling them off privately. Snow and rain got into a structure engineered to be an eternal temple, and concrete meant to last centuries started cracking within a couple of decades. Today, it stands officially closed, structurally unstable, and almost impossible to keep people out of. Urban explorers treat it like a pilgrimage site, climbing through broken windows and rusted fencing to photograph a ceiling that was supposed to survive the century it was built in. There have been discussions in recent years about restoring the site as a cultural monument, though nothing has been confirmed or finished. What's left right now is a shattered mosaic ring, tiles missing like a mouth losing teeth, fog drifting through a dome built to outlast the ideology it was celebrating. Buzludzha collapsed because the ideology behind it collapsed. The next structure on this list didn't fail because of politics at all. It failed because of a war, and then it became something almost nobody watching it get built would have expected. In central Moscow, there's a spot where the tallest building on Earth was supposed to stand. In the 1930s, Soviet planners drew up designs for the Palace of the Soviets, over 400 meters tall, taller than the Empire State Building, crowned with a statue of Lenin so enormous that his head alone would have loomed larger than most buildings around it. The site wasn't empty land waiting to be used. The government demolished the Cathedral of Christ the Savior specifically to clear space for it, dynamiting a 19th century church to make room for a 20th century God. This was meant to be the literal center of world communism, visible for miles across the capital on a clear day, permanent proof that history had already picked a direction and Moscow was standing at the front of it. Construction actually started, and it moved fast. Steel framework rose out of the excavated foundation where the cathedral used to stand, and for a while it genuinely looked like the tallest building on the planet was underway. Then World War II arrived, and that steel got stripped away and repurposed for anti-tank defenses and emergency bridges, because tanks mattered more than towers in 1941. The project never resumed at full scale after the war ended. For years afterward, the site sat as an enormous flooded pit in the middle of Moscow, a monument to nothing, filling slowly with groundwater under open sky. Here's the part almost nobody expects. In the 1960s, the government filled that pit and converted it into the Moskva pool, the largest open-air public swimming pool in the world at the time. Steaming visibly in the freezing Moscow winter while swimmers did laps under falling snow, it operated for decades as one of the city's strangest and most beloved public landmarks. Then, in the 1990s, after the Soviet collapse, the pool was drained and the original cathedral was rebuilt on the exact same foundation, essentially undoing 60 years of Soviet ambition and restoring the very building the state had destroyed to make room for its replacement. A monument meant to announce a permanent, unshakable ideology became a public swimming pool, then reverted back into the religious building it was originally designed to erase completely. One future got canceled by war and swimming lessons. The next one got canceled by gravity and by a collapsing hangar roof. Out in the desert steppe of Kazakhstan, at Baikonur Cosmodrome, there's a massive derelict hangar. Inside it, still sitting on the concrete floor, is an actual Soviet space shuttle. Not a replica, not a mock-up built for museum display. The real orbiter, coated in years of dust, partially buried under debris from the roof that finally fell in above it. This is Buran, the Soviet answer to the American space shuttle program, developed through the final years of the Cold War as proof that Soviet engineering could match anything the United States was flying in orbit. In 1988, Buran flew once, uncrewed, completely automated, gliding back down through the atmosphere and landing itself on the runway without a single pilot aboard. A genuine technical milestone few space programs have ever matched even today. Then, within a few years, the Soviet Union stopped existing entirely. Funding for the whole program disappeared almost overnight. The orbiters were rolled into storage hangars at Baikonur, a facility Russia now leases from an independent Kazakhstan, and left there indefinitely with no clear future planned for any of them. In 2002, one of those hangar roofs finally gave way under its own weight. It killed workers inside and destroyed the flown Buran orbiter along with a full-scale rocket mock-up sitting beside it. Other Buran hardware still sits in neighboring hangars today, officially off-limits to visitors, but a frequent target for extreme urban explorers willing to sneak past Kazakh security just to photograph a spacecraft nobody has maintained in decades. A machine built to prove technological supremacy now sits silent under a caved-in roof in the same desert it once launched from. Dust settling on wings that once broke through the atmosphere. That future collapsed with a roof falling in. The next one collapsed because the secret it was built to protect simply stopped mattering to anyone at all. In Latvia, there's a town that officially never existed on any public map. Rows of gray Soviet apartment blocks stand completely empty, along with a school and a small shop, all of it slowly being swallowed by encroaching forest. Nearby, the skeletal remains of massive radar arrays still rise out of the trees, once part of the Soviet Union's early warning missile defense network, built to detect an attack that theoretically could come at any moment. This is Skrunda 1, a closed military settlement built to house the personnel who operated that radar system around the clock, in shifts, year after year. Residents lived entire lives inside it, going to school, buying groceries, raising children, without officially being located anywhere at all on any civilian record. When Latvia regained independence in 1991, Russian forces kept operating the site for several more years under a formal withdrawal agreement. But by the late 1990s, the strategic need for that particular radar installation had faded, and in 1995, one of the massive antenna towers was demolished with explosives as part of the negotiated withdrawal terms. The rest of the town emptied out shortly after, once the specific military reason for its existence had disappeared for good. Nobody ever moved back in. Skrunda 1 stands today largely intact, an entire Soviet-era neighborhood frozen mid-abandonment, its street lamps still standing over empty pavement, sometimes rented out for film shoots, sometimes walked through by curious travelers who find their way past the gate and the warning signs. A schoolroom there still has a chalkboard fixed to the wall, sunlight cutting through broken windows onto rows of empty desks, inside a town that officially never existed, and now, in practice, simply doesn't at all. Skrunda 1 vanished because the war it prepared for never arrived. The next place on this list vanished because its war already happened, underground over and over again, hundreds of times, in the same patch of steppe. In eastern Kazakhstan, there's a planned city built purely to support one of the most tested pieces of land on the planet. Kurchatov was constructed to house scientists, military personnel, and their families working alongside the Semipalatinsk test site, where the Soviet Union detonated hundreds of nuclear devices, both atmospheric and underground, across roughly 4 decades of continuous testing. The town had schools, apartment blocks, a proper central square, everything an ordinary Soviet city needed, except that its entire reason for existing depended on a weapons program running just outside the city limits. Public protests against continued testing grew louder through the late 1980s, part of a wider wave of anti-nuclear activism across the Soviet Union, with local activists eventually forcing the issue onto the national stage. Testing wound down around 1989, and the site formally closed in 1991 as Kazakhstan became an independent nation. Once the program ended, so did the specific reason Kurchatov had been built. Much of its specialized scientific and military population left almost immediately, taking decades of institutional purpose and expertise with them to other cities, leaving behind apartment blocks built for a population that had simply stopped needing them. Parts of the city are still inhabited today, though at a fraction of its former population. The surrounding test zone remains contaminated in patches decades later, and researchers still monitor radiation levels in the soil and groundwater there, tracking a legacy that outlasted the program itself by generations. Apartment balconies overlook a flat horizon that used to shake, physically shake underfoot, with underground detonations. Now there's just wind moving across empty steppe grass. That city emptied because a weapons program closed. The last place on this list didn't empty because of war or politics or funding running out. It emptied because the sea it was built around simply disappeared beneath it, slowly, then all at once. In Central Asia, there are fishing ports sitting nowhere near any water at all. Rasted trawlers lie, stranded on cracked, sun-baked ground, miles from a visible coastline, propaganda murals celebrating the Soviet fishing industry still standing on nearby walls right beside them. This is what remains of towns like Moynak in Uzbekistan and Aralsk in Kazakhstan, both built directly around the Aral Sea, once one of the largest inland bodies of water on the planet, ranked among the biggest lakes on Earth. Soviet planners diverted the rivers feeding the Aral Sea to irrigate cotton fields across the region, a hallmark of the kind of centralized industrial ambition that assumed nature itself could simply be redirected to serve state production targets, no matter how large the body of water in the way. The sea began shrinking rapidly, starting in the 1960s, and the retreat accelerated sharply through the following 2 decades, faster than most scientists at the time believed possible for a lake of that size. By the time officials publicly acknowledged what was happening, the shoreline had pulled back dozens of kilometers from the ports that had been built specifically to sit on it, stranding entire fleets in the process. Fishing fleets that once supplied thriving canneries were left stranded on newly exposed desert floor, sitting in sand where boats have no business sitting. The canneries themselves shut down for good, taking local jobs with them. Today, those rusted ships sit as a dark tourism landmark, positioned exactly where the water used to reach. Murals of fishermen and overflowing nets still painted on nearby buildings, quietly advertising an industry the sea can no longer support in any form. Every one of these places was built as though something backing it, an ideology, a technology, an economy, an entire ecosystem, was permanent and unshakable, guaranteed to still be standing a century later. None of them were. Buzludzha's ideology collapsed within months. The palace of the Soviets lost its steel to a war and then lost its swimming pool to history. Buran proved Soviet engineering worked and then sat under a broken roof anyway. Skrunda 1 guarded against a war that never came. Kurchatov supported a program that public pressure and national independence eventually shut down, and the Aral Sea's ports simply watched the water walk away from them, year after year, until there was nothing left to fish. What's left isn't really the ideology, or the war footing, or the scientific ambition, or the fishing economy. What's left is fog drifting through a shattered mosaic dome, a rebuilt cathedral standing over a drain pool, a spacecraft gathering dust under collapsed steel, a chalkboard in an empty schoolroom, apartment balconies overlooking silent test grounds, and fishing boats rusting on dry seabed under an open sky. The future they were built for never arrived, but the buildings somehow, against every plan, still did.